Have you ever tried to draw a creature like this, but felt like something was off? I mean, it's definitely got fur, but it doesn't feel like fur. It looks like a scraggly, stubbly mess. And maybe you've made similar mistakes when trying to draw beasts, animals, or fur textures on objects. But here's the thing. Most people struggling to draw fur aren't actually bad at drawing. They're just making the same few mistakes over and over. But once you learn to spot them, they're actually pretty easy to fix, and it can lead to something much more appealing like this. Today we're going to walk through the creation of this drawing I made to pinpoint those exact mistakes and show how to fix each one. So here's the first mistake, and honestly this is the one that can undermine everything else: drawing fur as if light doesn't exist. If you look at these two versions, the first one has the same darkness of fur everywhere. There's really no indication of light and shadow, and every mark is treated the same, causing it to look super flat. But now let's look at this bear. Even though it has fairly dark, uniform fur, you can clearly see brighter and darker areas. And that's the underlying form causing the fur to catch the light or not. So before we even think about texture, we need to decide where our light source is and block in the basic shading on our creature, which I'll add as if it's under an overhead ambient light source. Nothing dramatic. Now, a few super helpful tips on shading, which I learned many years ago while studying under the amazing creature designer Bobby Rebholz. He has a killer YouTube channel, by the way, which I'll link to below. The first thing to note is where I'm holding my pencil. Instead of holding it right near the point, I'm actually holding it further back and with a much looser grip. And instead of drawing by pushing it with my fingers, I'm pivoting from the wrist as the pencil just barely grazes the paper surface. If this grip feels unfamiliar, grab a scrap piece of paper and just practice making some patches of tone like I'm doing here. Let your hand warm up and focus on light, even passes. You might try with lines that are going back and forth, or maybe just in a single direction. See what happens when you taper the pressure to be harder at the start, or with lines that are spaced a bit further out. And all of this experimentation will not look pretty, but that's hardly the point. You're really just equipping your hand with the methods it can access when drawing different textures down the line. I often find it helpful to lay in a very light overall passive tone when beginning a section. Then I'll move on from the largest forms, such as the body or an entire arm, and then into the individual muscle groups that I'm defining in my drawing. As I move along, you'll see me alternate from holding the pencil further back to shade, and then tightening toward the point when I need to exact smaller shapes, such as the claws or teeth. But even so, I'm not pushing my dark values all the way dark yet. There may be 50 to 60% dark at the moment, but as I develop the value of the piece overall, I can then add additional passes to push my value range as far as I want. Our base values are established, the light source is clear, and we've built the foundation that we need to block in the value of the largest masses of fur. But again, I haven't been focusing on applying any texture yet. Right now, the mane, the tufts of fur on the arm, and the end of the tail are just shaded lightly, like they're a part of the underlying form. Oh, and if you'd like to see more examples of how I'm using these techniques, check out the playlist where I'm drawing every creature from scripture, linked below. Now, let's actually draw some fur, which is where mistake number 2 shows up. When most people sit down to draw fur, they start drawing lines. Lots and lots of little lines of every individual hair. And now look, I'm not going to tell you to never draw individual hairs. There's a time and a place for that technique, depending upon the fur texture, how zoomed in you're drawing, and how photorealistic your work is. But whether you're going for that level of detail or not, there's a way of approaching fur that will help us organize all of those details. Going from this, which I'll be honest, just kind of grosses me out, to this, which actually shows the volume of the fur. And here's the general rule I want you to remember: clumps over strands. I'll show you how I went about this in a second, but let's look at some references to see when you even need to draw fur in the first place. Because if the fur is especially short or fine, such as you see on the body of horses, some dogs, otters, and so on, you really can't see clumps of fur nor even individual hairs. In these cases, simply hatching in the direction of the hair growth will be enough. But what about animals like these? These definitely have clumps of fur, but how do we actually lay that in? Well, first, we need to think about where the hair is originating and in the direction that it's flowing. You won't necessarily see a cowlick like you see here, but that's an example of an origin point. Other times, it will generally flow from the head to tail and top to bottom. Here, I'm drawing tapered shapes for my clumps, but this is where getting photo reference for different hair textures will really come in handy. But whatever the case, note how the clumps are following the underlying form of my sphere. You don't necessarily have to shade the underlying form as much as I did here for demonstration purposes, but you will want to think of each clump as its own little 3D form that's sitting on top of the body. In this example, you should still be able to tell that the object is a sphere, even when it's covered in fairly thick clumps of fur. Switching back to my drawing, you can see what this looks like drawn at a smaller scale. I use my kneaded eraser to carve back into my shaded area, since my ambient light is most directly hitting this portion, and then fading as the form falls into shadow. I use a series of triangular and tapered shapes to lay in the tufts of fur as they spiral out from an origin point behind the ear, something I took from photo references of lion manes. And though this is definitely sped up, really make sure you're taking your time on this stage, and don't hesitate to use your eraser to carve back into those individual clumps. As the fur gets further out from the origin point, I'm allowing the clumps to get a bit larger. This will help direct the eye toward the focal point of the creature's face by having smaller, more detailed areas closer to that area. So that's mistake number 2 handled. Now let's talk about the mistake that, I'll be honest, I made for years without realizing it. Let's bring our deranged friend back again, as he has something important to teach us, and that's the mistake of putting the same level of detail everywhere. And there's a few ways we can fix this. The first is pretty subtle, but it's a fundamental aspect of shading that will greatly increase the realism of your drawings. And it's that you should see the most texture where the underlying form is transitioning from light to dark. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to our shaded sphere of fur. You can see the most texture isn't here where the light is hitting the form most directly, nor is the most texture in full shadow, of course. Instead, it's right here in the transition zone. This is sometimes called the terminator line, and it's where light is raking across the surface at the harshest angle. So every little bump, every clump of fur catches the light on one side and then casts a shadow on the other. Now, the ambient lighting conditions that I'm drawing my beast in will make it so that this disparity in texture isn't as extreme as the photo of the moon. But the principle still holds across nature. If we look at this bear again, the lower legs and underbelly are darker, and there's not much detail shown there. In fact, if I painted those areas a flat dark brown, you'd barely even notice. But along the body, where the ambient light transitions from the top down, that's where we see all of this texture. So here's where I'm applying this to my drawing. I'm concentrating my tightest marks in this region here, where the mane is transitioning from lit to shadowed. But there's another way that we can control the amount of texture in our drawings, and that's with what's known as detail density. On my drawing, I wanted the mane and the face to be the focal point of the beast, so I've concentrated more detail density there. But elsewhere, I'm allowing the body to largely be covered in short fur that isn't as thick and detailed, and it's just fine enough to show the muscle anatomy coming through. To keep it looking like fur though, I'm allowing my shading to appear more hatched, using individual lines to delineate the forms of the muscles. And this isn't an attempt to draw individual hairs, by the way, but it's about creating a rougher texture that evokes a fur-like appearance. Then, to further control my detail density, I purposefully allow the back limbs and tail to appear somewhat underdeveloped, as though they're falling back into the fog or atmosphere. This is another technique that Bobby Rebholz has mastered in his creature drawings, and it's a great way to guide the viewer's attention to the focal point of your drawings. Now you can really see what's making these two images appear so differently. The fur suddenly has depth, and it's not because I drew more, but because I drew smarter. The last mistake we'll cover is shorter, but it can kill more drawings than anything else, and that's treating every edge the same way. If every area of fur has a sharp, defined edge, your drawing will look more graphic or even cartoony, which is totally fine if that's your aim, but real fur has variety. Some edges are sharp, some are soft, some will dissolve into the surrounding fur or even into the background. And that variety is what makes it read as organic. This is where it's especially helpful to view your eraser not merely to correct mistakes, but as a tool to pull back from what you've added into your drawing. You might consider using a kneaded eraser to fade out portions of the creature's silhouette, creating what's called a lost edge as it fades into the background. Or you might use a tighter eraser to pull back around the edge of fur that catches the light, like you see in photos here. Or if you're using toned paper as I am, you can take out a white colored pencil. Less is often more with highlights, but it can add that last subtle pop to your drawing. Whatever the case, remember that not every clump of fur needs a crisp edge. Some should fade off pretty softly, especially in shadowed areas. So let's recap the 4 mistakes in order and how to fix them. The first mistake is ignoring light and form, and we fix that by blocking in your values first, understanding that fur sits on top of the form and not instead of it. The second mistake is drawing too many strands instead of clumps of fur, and we fix that by dividing the body into smaller masses of fur. The third mistake is rendering texture everywhere, and we fix that by rendering more texture where the light transitions to shadow, concentrating details near the focal point, and allowing portions of the design to fade off into the background. And the last mistake is overworking the edges, which we can correct by varying how sharp or soft they are. And that's the framework: form, flow, texture, and edges. If you work in that order and avoid these 4 traps, you'll get fur that reads clearly, looks believable, and honestly takes less time than drawing every individual hair. Give this video a watch next to see how I developed the fur of an end times beast that the prophet Daniel saw in scripture. And if this video helped you, give it a like and subscribe so that the algorithm pushes it out to more people wanting to learn tangible art skills. And until later, God bless and keep creating.